Hello, everyone. We want to welcome you to our webinar today. We're excited to have Chad Williams with us from Inovia Consulting. And Chad is going to be presenting on his part 2 webinar of Explore the Possibilities with Power Apps. And for those of you that would like to watch part 1, you can find that on our website in our webinar library. And I know you're all eager to get started with this presentation. So before I pass it on over to Chad to cover on this hot topic, I just want to remind you that we are recording this session as well as all of our sessions, and it will be posted to our on-demand webinar library for you to review again or share with anyone. And if you do have any questions, please feel free to type those in the questions box, and we will have a Q&A at the end of our session. So now I'll pass it on over to Chad to kick off our presentation.
Welcome, everybody. So this is Explore the Possibility of Power Apps, part 2. And I am Chad Williams. I am our COO. So nowadays, I spend most of my time working with our delivery teams, but many years ago, I started here as a developer and still love to stay close to the technology. And so that's why about a year ago, I agreed to do this session. And so I've done the part 1 piece of this a few times now. We've got our webinar I did at a customer conference, and if you were out at Summit and happened to stay till the very last session there, I had done this there as well. So what I'm going to do today is really to dive a little bit deeper. So the objective of that first part, and I'll give you a little bit of review for those of you who either haven't seen it or don't remember from when I went through it before, but I'll do a very brief recap of that, and then I will get into it here. So the goal here today is really fairly focused. So I wanted to focus on the connecting of the data piece. So as I said in the first series, an app really is useless without data. And so to really do anything with Power Apps, we need to get data to it. And so what I want to talk about is how do we get that data from Business Central to Power Apps using the custom APIs. All right, so how we'll go through that today is, so first, again, I'll give a little bit of a recap just to get everybody on the same playing field, if you will, or on what we went through in the first part. Then I'm going to talk about the Business Central custom APIs, a little bit of an overview, but then we're going to get into it, and we're actually going to look at some code, and I'll show you how those are actually built. We'll look at the example that I've built for this demo that I use in here, and then go from there. So once the APIs are out there, then we need to consume them in a connector in Power Platform. So I'm going to talk through that, and I'm going to show you the custom connector that I've built, walk through some of the steps and different aspects of that and how you create that and how you maintain that. And then finally, we'll look at the Power App that I built and how I actually wired the data up. So I'm going to bounce back and forth here a little bit between PowerPoint and slides, between PowerPoint and demo. So hopefully the screen switching works out here. I've only got a few slides. Most of this I want to spend showing you this stuff. So with that, we'll get started. So let's take a quick review. So if you recall, or if you weren't on it, what I have here is basically my own tenant that I am working in. This tenant here, it's just a stock Kronos USA company, if you're familiar with that demo data. So I have my own tenant. I've got an environment here that I'm using. This one just is the production environment. I've got multiple environments within this tenant, multiple sandbox environments as well, but I'm just working against this environment here. I have some Power Apps. So if you saw this, this should look familiar, but so what I did is, well, let me start here. So about 10 years ago, we had a number of customers coming to us that were looking for kind of a simple data collection app. They didn't want to deploy clients to everybody and train everybody on how to use clients. It was really just a matter of being able to enter a little bit of data out on the shop floor and then have that come back into NAV at the time. So that takes us roughly around, version 2009. We're on the RTC, we're on, the 3-tier client, we've got web services. So we thought, okay, let's undertake this. We've got enough interest out there in our existing customers, and let's build this. So I worked on this shop floor data collection app, and so it was at the time built in C#, and I think it was WPF. Hundreds of hours of development, certainly 200, probably more. Fairly complex, lots of code. There was obviously some learning there as well, but fairly complex solution. A lot of different pieces that we needed to take care of, anywhere from how's the security going to work, how are we going to manage updates, how are we going to manage deploying the application, how are we going to handle the communication with the service tier, where is the service tier, where is the app going to be running, all of those things. So as I walk through the first part of this, many of those were some of the benefits that I cited as far as Power Apps. There's a lot of that you just do not have to work for. The infrastructure, if you will, that's already built, the platform that is the Power Platform, handles a lot of that. So because I'm authenticated to my tenant, it knows who I am, and it knows what I have access to. It knows how I can log into Business Central. It knows where Business Central is. I don't have to give it a bunch of URLs or different things in setting up connections. And so it was very simple, but really wanted to take that application that we built 10 years ago and try to see how it might work in Power Apps. So this was the output of that. So I'm in the Power Apps app section here. This is the application I've built. I've got 4 versions of this. This first version is really what we're going to focus on today. If you saw the first part, the other 3 versions were really just to showcase Power BI. So the goal, again, in part 1 of this was just to get your head kind of thinking about where could I use this in my app, in my company. Not only the Power App side, but also trying to highlight some of the neat things you can do with the AI that's built in, as far as, for example, I showed being able to take a picture of an object, have it recognize the object, and even count how many of those objects might be in that picture. So this is the simple application that I built. This is the version 1 of that. It doesn't have any of the artificial intelligence pieces in it. So it's just a simple screen. The idea here being that I wanted to be able to show a shop user the different release production orders. So this is a release production order, 101,005 for item 1,000, and then it's basically the operation for the assembly department. So I'm looking at an operation on a release production order. When I drill into this, it's going to open up a screen that populates the key fields related to the entry that I'm making, the order number, item number, and operation number. And then I can simply come in here and enter my values. So if I had a runtime of 25 minutes, I made 60 of these and I scrapped 3. If I wanted to finish the operation, I could flag that here. Otherwise, I just submit this and it's going to send the data back to my Business Central environment. And if I look at my output journal, you'll see here it posted this line. It didn't post it, it just created the item journal line. It could still be reviewed and then posted. So runtime of 25, I did 60, and then I scrapped 3. So that was essentially what I wanted to demo in terms of what the app did, and then we went from there and showcased some of the other features of AI. And so today, what I want to do is talk through now technically, how did I get this data back and forth? So there's really 2 aspects to the app here. One being the second part where I posted the output entry back and then somehow created an output journal line, which is an item journal line. It's in the item journal line table. And then there's this front screen that populates a list of the release production order or the output steps in release production. So there's just really two pieces to this. So it's getting data from Business Central and then it's sending data back. And so that's the basis of what I'm going to go through and just a bit of a recap on what we covered last time. So I'm going to pop back to my slide here. And of course, it's going to switch the wrong way each time. Okay, so let's talk then about the Business Central custom API. So the first thing we need to be able to do is get the data out of Business Central, or we need to be able to send external data back into Business Central. So the starting point for that is going to be the Business Central API. So there are 44 stock APIs that Microsoft has built that are there and ready for you to use. I showed an example of building an app from scratch using the item data set or the item API in the last session. It's, so you could imagine there's 1,000, 2,000 tables, whatever it is. I've lost track over the years in Business Central. There's a lot of tables. Then you have all your custom tables. You've got all the custom fields you add to stock tables. So as you can imagine, 44 stock APIs probably isn't going to cut it. Really just gives you an idea of what you can do. Maybe it's going to work for some of your applications, but in most cases, you're probably going to need to create a custom API. Even if you said, well, I need items, and you go look at the item API, it doesn't include every field from the item table. It's just a small data set of fields from the item. So descriptions, some of the basic ones that you might expect, unit measure, base unit measure. But as soon as you need a field that maybe it's a stock field, but it's not in the API, you need a field that you've added, because I know nobody adds fields to the item table, right? Everybody does. Everybody adds fields to customer tables, vendors, etc. And so you're likely going to need to head this route pretty quickly. So so the 44 stock APIs, it's just really not enough to get at all of the data you're likely going to want to use. So the data that I used for this app, it was not in part of those stock APIs. So, and again, just you can think of those 44 as just 44 different data sets that are exposed, and it's just whatever somebody at Microsoft sat down and said, hey, this would be nice. It shows the concept, but is it going to fulfill everybody's needs? No, but we're going to build this platform to build custom APIs. So the custom APIs are intended to connect to any other data. So any other stock tables in Business Central, any other fields on those same tables that the stock API is exposed. So if you needed different data from the item table, for example, you can create a custom API for that. If you have a custom table in the 50,000 range that you're using, you're going to want a custom API. Fields that you've added to the customer table, sales order, sales lines, etc., custom API. So these APIs, they're built on the REST API standard. So if you're familiar with that, there's not going to be anything totally new here to learn. The beauty of that is if you understand how that works, then you kind of understand how to interact with these APIs. So you're going to post, you're going to have post, get, your different commands that you're going to issue against the endpoint, and so it's fairly straightforward. Now I will say, and you'll see it more as I go through this today, if you don't have kind of a basic knowledge of that, I really would encourage you to brush up on that or get to read up on it. I would say I had fairly minimal to maybe medium knowledge of it. I've worked with it in the past over the years, but not with any frequency to really command it, if you will. And so even for myself, it was helpful to just kind of refresh on it a little bit. But it really isn't that complicated, and it is intended to be very easy to work with. So within Business Central, so when it actually comes to, okay, well, how do we create a custom API? What is it? It's really just two different object types. So I have pages and queries of type API. The pages are for your create, read, update, delete, if you're going to be inserting, modifying data. If you're going to just have read-only data, then a query would be a good option. So for my application, a page was necessary. For the, if I was building something that was just going to display data in a read-only format, or maybe a report, I could go the query route. So in Business Central, if you're familiar with some of the development, you know that pages have different types. I have card pages, I have list pages, so they have just simply added another type of page that is, that is called API. So it does require some coding. I mean, it is going to require you to create an extension within your environment, or add it to an existing extension, depending on how you've got your extension set up within your environment. But if you've got some knowledge of that, this is going to be very simple. So, it's going to take a little bit of development skills behind this. If you've got a developer on staff, maybe doesn't necessarily know AL and how to write extensions, I'm sure they can figure this out. And certainly with, that's something we are happy to help with in doing a little bit of training from a development standpoint, whether that's getting somebody started with writing extensions, or if they've already written some of their extensions. If they're at that point, I think you'll see in what I show it's pretty simple to pick up, and the documentation on creating the pages in Microsoft Docs are pretty good. And then once we've got this API created and we've published our extension, then that's what we can use to create our custom connector that will then plug into Power Apps that we'll get to. All right, so let's talk about this API page type. So as with any object in Business Central, there's going to be some properties on it. And so we already had a page type property that sometimes we set to card, list, etc. And so now that accepts the value of API. Once I do that, then it enables a number of API specific fields, if you will, that I need to specify. So I've got API publisher, API group, version, entity name, and entity set name. Really all of those just describe what it is for the most part, so that it'll be used in the URL for the endpoint and how you reference it. So the publisher, who created it. So maybe Innovia Consulting, your company name, however you might do that. The group, you could think of that as what part of a modification is this, part of a commissions mod, what greater part might that be part of. In my case, I might just call it shop floor data collection, or SFDC for an abbreviation or something like that. The version just specifies the version of this, so I can version my API if I needed to. The entity name and entity set name, then that actually gets into the actual data. So if it's item, might be the entity name, item set, or items might be the entity set name, shop floor data collection line, or shop floor data collection line. So that's essentially the data that you're exposing. So that looking back at those stock 44, those 44 each have an entity name and entity set name. Just some naming conventions here that I threw up here that Microsoft encourages. So camel case, so lowercase the first word and uppercase the second. For those fields, it will work if you don't. I tend to like to see Innovia Consulting capitalized, so I didn't even think to lowercase the I, but everything worked just fine. You do need to stick with alphanumeric, capitals, lowercase, and then 0 through 9. And then the version does have a format to it, so it's a lowercase v followed by a major version dot minor, if you will, or 1.0, 2.0, 2.1, but all prefixed with a lowercase v. Or if you are just working and demoing this, or you're just working to test this out and you're just in beta, you can also just specify beta. So once you've specified the properties, the rest of the page really doesn't look any different than a regular list or repeater page in Business Central. So it's going to have the same layout to the rest of the file. It's going to have a repeater section, and then within the repeater section, you're going to have the fields. And whatever fields you put up there are the fields that are going to be available. You're going to give the field a name. You can give it the same name following the naming conventions for that the field already has in the table in Business Central, or you can give it a little bit more user-friendly name if you like, and that's the name that will be seen to the outside world. Each entity must be uniquely identified, so it has to have a primary key, and it has to be a simple primary key. So you really would want to use a GUID for this. So I don't know exactly where Microsoft snuck this in, but somewhere in one of the updates or one of the major releases over the last couple of years, they've added a system ID field to every stock table that is a GUID. So if you are using a stock table and you want to, expose some data from that table, you can just include that system ID as that key field, so that the outside world knows how to uniquely identify and reference that record. It can't be a multi-value or a multi-field type of complex key. If you're creating a new table, just add a GUID field, if it works in that table, to use that as the primary key, which I think in most scenarios it would. You can do that, or create your key as you normally would, and then just make sure you add a GUID and populate the value when you create the record. And then you can add that to your API page so that it knows how to reference those records. And the other thing is with the formatting, because the GUID would end up in a URL of the endpoint, you really want to stick with a GUID. I can't say for sure if you could use other types, but you're going to get stuck with, you can't have special characters or other things up there. So really, I wish I knew for sure. I would say almost 90% positive you're going to want to use a GUID, or you absolutely would. But I don't know that it necessarily enforces it, but the data value that you have would have to be formatted that it would be okay in a URL. So stick with the GUID. And then finally, the page. So one thing you can't do is you can't extend a page type of API. So if you've already built one and you want to change it, or somebody else has built one, you can't extend it. You can't change it. You would just have to create a new one. All right, so let's take a look at some code here again. So I'm going to go to Visual Studio. So this is just simply the extension that I've built that is already deployed in this tenant. It's just got a couple of simple files to it. One of them I didn't end up using, but it's still in this extension. So I'm going to show you just those and what this looks like. So first of all, I've got just an empty file here because I want to show you how easy this is to actually get started. So if you've been working in here, you're familiar with snippets. So I'm going to just pull up a snippet for the page here. So here's my card page, list page. Oh, hey, here's API page. So if I tab and bring that in, it's going to bring in and lay this out for me. So I don't have to do a lot of guessing, like, hey, what were all those properties that that Chad showed us? What do I need to specify? Well, that's the beauty of snippets, and the rest of the world has been benefiting from these for a long time, and it's great now to be in AL and VS Code to be able to take advantage of this. So you can see by already it defaulted the AP page type to API. I've got caption just like on any other page, and then I've got all these API fields that I shared with you earlier, so I can specify the publisher group, etc. I still specify a table name, no different than, or a source table, just like I would on any and in any other page. So if my source table was item, I'm going to set that to item, and then it sets by default the delayed insert to true. So really, if you ignore all of this, this looks just like a normal list page or repeater page in Business Central. Now, most pages will have actions or buttons on them, but you certainly wouldn't have that here. But otherwise, it's really just a repeater section with the fields named. So here would be my field from the table. So if I did description, and then this is just my name that it's going to see. So if I wanted to do just something like that, I could, and then I can set the caption. If I need to add more fields, it's no different than adding fields to any other type of page. I just go and enter a new field and continue. So again, it requires some code, but you're not writing, just lines and lines of code. It's really just structuring this. And again, with the snippets, it gets you 90% of the way there. You just fill in the blanks. All right, so let's actually look at then the pages that I use in my application. So the first one, the operation. So this is how I get this data in. So how do I pull this data out of an app? And so the way I've done that is so there was no stock API that gave me this data. So this data actually comes out of the production order routing line table, which is tied to a production order. And I am looking at production orders that have a status of released. And so, but I've specified, my other basic properties for a API page, excuse me. So you can see I've set my publisher. This group was just from when I originally built this for Summit, when I did the demo there originally. Got my entity name and my entity set name and version. So all of these will be important. You will need to know these exactly because they will be referenced when you build out the URL for your endpoint. They will be used there. One property here that does not come in the snippet, it may come in, there's other folks that have published snippets besides what comes with the AL extension that you install into VS Code. So some of those may include this, but there's this OData key fields that I am almost positive needs to be specified. So this is what's telling it what's that unique field that identifies the record. So just be aware of that does not come in the snippet. So here, so then I've got my repeater section, and then I just get into the different fields. So I started off with my field. So again, as I said earlier, they've added the system ID field to all the tables. I've just changed the name of that to lowercase ID. And then my field. So I've got the production order number, item number. I did include the description. I don't show that on the page. I've got the operation, etc. So all those fields that I need to send over, I've included. And then I've included, like I said, a few others that I foresee needing, but I did not expose or did not add to the application in this simplistic demo that I did. So the order number, etc., that's where all of that is built. And then when I show you in Power Apps, you'll see how that's referenced, how those field names come in. So that covers getting the data to the app. How do I get the data back? So there's probably other ways to do this. I chose just to create a custom table that I will basically insert a line to from the Power App, and then that will trigger the action inside of Business Central that I need to get it to the item journal line. So this is just a simple table. If you've created tables, there's nothing fancy to see here. I did create the table with a field that I just called ID. It's a GUID. As of that, I'm using as the primary key. I've got these other values that I need. So I need to be able to send back the order number so it knows what I was working on, item number. So I've got some of those reference fields that I got from my operations that will then tell the system what order I was working against. And then down at the bottom, I've got the user entered fields where they're entering quantity, runtime, scrap quantity, or marking it as finished. And then down here, you'll just see there's my key that I created. And then if you're not familiar with using a GUID, you just simply create the GUID value on insert of the record so that it populates the value, because it's not a field that a user's going to enter. It's an internal field. And then down here is just, so here's where I actually had to write some logic, some business logic to actually create the item journal line. But this, this isn't necessarily part of the application. It's utilized, but so there's, depending on what your app's going to ultimately do, you may need a little help with the business logic that needs to be written. But this is something I've done many times. So I know how to populate and create an output journal line, which is basically inserted into the item journal line. And as you can see, I've got a little bit of hard coding here that I've done because this is a demo that, I would otherwise change and build setup tables or setup fields in Business Central so that they could specify what journal and batch those would go to. And then, so now that I've got this table, there's no API around it yet. And so that's where this final file comes in. And so I created my page around that table of type API. So again, all the same stuff that I had specified in the other files, my API fields, and then you can see here my source table is this custom table I just created. And then I've got my repeater section here with all of the fields that I wanted to show. So I wouldn't have to include every field that's in the table. I can just include the ones I want. If I had needed to join data from a separate table, let's say I needed something from the item, for example, I could get the item and add that field here as well to show that I wouldn't have to create a separate data set. I can put that together with code on the single page. All right, so then once all of this is built, I build my solution, I build my app, and then I deploy that to my tenant. So that all of that's been done. And if I go up here to my tenant again, just take a look at my extensions, you'll see here in the lengthy list here that comes in the stock. Here's my Inovia Consulting and then just my shop floor demo app. So now that it's out there, I've got something to work with. So, okay, so now I've built my API page. What does that mean? What do I do from here? So let me just, I'm gonna switch quickly back to the slideshow here for a moment. And so, so now that I've built the API page, I've published my extension, what's now happened all behind the scenes is there's a new endpoint out there for me to look at. So, if I look at those 44 stock APIs, there's a specific URL endpoint that I can hit for those. It will change a little bit based on environment and company, et cetera. But they're sitting there and they're ready to go the moment I spin up my new tenant. So now that I've published my extension, these are ready to go. And so now I can go and hit these URLs. So ultimately, I'm going to have to build the custom connector in the Power Platform to call these endpoints. So first of all, I want to just talk about the endpoints of it. So I would say this was one of the more challenging pieces of this. And really just because of the lack of clarity in the documentation, or at least as I read it. A year ago, about when I started down this, there wasn't a lot out there. In the last couple of weeks, I've looked. There's a little bit more out there, but not all of it is entirely clear. And so this, and if you recall from the first one, I talked about URLs when you're creating connections. And one of the beautiful things of working with SaaS and being all within this tenant is you don't have to worry about it. Well, you do have to worry about it a little bit here, but it's still not like I've seen in some other areas. I remember the first time we tried to wire up, I think it was the Power BI report pack that they released with an environment. It was very sparse documentation on how it needed to be formatted, especially when you started to introduce the company name to the URL. And we ultimately found it was just a matter of a uppercase or lowercase or one space somewhere, or it was just, and it just, it wasn't clearly documented, at least we felt. And so this wasn't all that different. And so it took piecing together Microsoft documentation and a few community posts that are out there to ultimately arrive at this. But so the base URL that you're going to be going against is simply HTTPS api.businesscentral.dynamics.com v2.0. That, for the most part won't change. I expect this version is going to change, and that was part of the problem when I started this. I don't remember if it was still in beta or if it was still in V1, but we had just got the release, and so what the newest version we were working with was on V2. The documentation all spoke to everything else, so that was a bit challenging. So once you got that, then you need your tenant ID. So that is simply, if you look at your URL in Business Central, I'm not going to switch to it, so I don't have to bounce between screens here, but I'll show you when I close this. But if you look at the, even just in Business Central, or if you're in Power Apps or any of those, you're going to have this GUID in your URL that's your tenant ID. And then the environment name, I highlighted that as well in that URL earlier. That was just production in this one. and then followed with API /. So that's the base of your URL, the starting point. I just wanted to call out this. I haven't worked with it much. I don't know if this it was added since last year, but I did see this when I was updating my information in this past week, but you can hit that endpoint there to list out the environments that are in your tenant. So if you recall when I created that example application using the stock connector against the stock item API, when I started to create that connector in the Power Platform, it sat there and spun for 20 seconds or so. And while it was doing that, it was going out and looking at all of the environments and then all of the companies within each environment that I had in my tenant. So, you know, always looking towards how do we, you know, not wanting to hard code things, obviously, and how do we make these, you know, scalable, or if we're going to repeat this for other customers or build them for other customers, you know, there is the ability to get that. Along the similar lines, we can also get the company. So I'll now show you this one. So it's basically that base URL followed by v1.0 and then / companies. And then that will list out all the companies that are in my environment and in my tenant. You know, we always got to talk about security. So there's basically two methods you're going to use for security. You can do basic authentication, username, and your token. So in Business Central, when you set up a new user, you have your web key token that you can create. You would use that along with the username if you were going to just do testing, and that's what I'm doing here today. For production, you really want to use Azure Active Directory and make sure that it's all part of that single sign-on and authenticated through that. All right, so let's go back and then look at these endpoints now. So the first thing I want to do here, so again, this is my URL for my Business Central tenant. So that tenant ID is this big long GUID, and the environment is production. So that's part of what I was referencing there. So the next thing I'm going to jump over to, if you haven't, if you're not familiar with Postman, whenever you're working with these type of APIs, you know, Postman or something similar is really essential to testing. So this allows you to hit those endpoints and post your commands, whether it's a get or a post or a put against it, and then to be able to inspect what it's returning. It lets you figure out how it needs to be formatted, your headers, parameters, etc., as you're sending in your request. And it's all of this information that then feeds into creating the custom connector in the Power Platform. So I've ran this already, so you can see the results, but you'll see here, here's the URL, here's my base URL that I showed on the page before, followed by the companies. I'll pull that out into TextPad so you can see it closer on this next one. But this one here is just going to list out the company. So just to show that this actually does work and I didn't just have that sitting there already. So I just hit send, and what that does is it posts a get command to that URL. It sent the header and everything, and then it sends back the results. And I can see here, it gave me back 2 records for the 2 companies that are in my environment, my Kronos USA that I've been working in, and then this my company that's sitting out there that I'm not using. So then let's look at the get operations. So again, back on this screen, when I pull in these, I have to get all these operations. And that's what this one is. So this is so now I'm going to copy this. So I'm just going to copy everything after the base part of the URL. So we've seen that. And then because that's so small, I'm just going to drop this in Notepad here. Hopefully that's a little bit easier to see so you can see. So if you imagine here, you've got, you know, base URL. So all of that we had already determined. And then, so here's where you can see where the API properties come into play. So here's that publisher. So Innovia Consulting, it's got to be exact. That API group, Summit, the version. And then that is followed by the company. So you have to tell it what company you're using. So I specify companies, parenthesis, and then the GUID of my company. So if I look back here to my companies, you know, I have to know, I have to send that value back. Excuse me. And then finally, the data set name. So I'm referencing the data set, not the data, or the data entity set name, not just the entity. So I want the production output entries, not just one of them, or I'm not just referencing or working with one. So I want the data set. So I then reference that. And so that's the exact same name then again that was in here that I am taking back. So all of those values come from these fields. So the publisher, the group, the version, and then in this instance, the entity name. So whatever you put here, it's got to be exact. So I'm just trying to hit that point because you'll waste a lot of time trying to figure out why you don't get anything back when you just make a typo. So if something's not working, double check those. Yeah, so and then that's really the base of that URL. So I'm going to come back here and just run this. Again, I have this populated from when I ran it earlier, but if I hit send on this, it's going to do a get to that endpoint, and then it's going to return my order. So this is returning. This happens to be hitting, I think, a different environment. I'm hitting sandbox environment, so the order number is a little different, but you get the idea. So this is that data set back. And then again, you can see here's where those field names come into play. So on a lowercase I and then D and order number. So as I had specified here in my API page, so this part of the field, so that's where those names are coming from. I don't actually know that this caption does anything. I've specified them here, but as you can see, this is what shows up. And that's what I reference when I work with it. So as you can see here in Postman, again, that's the name of the fields that it's giving back. So again, if you're, I recommend, if you're not really familiar with working with these APIs, you'll do yourself, a big favor if you just spend a little bit of time brushing up on this and brushing up a little bit on Postman or whatever utility you may prefer, or if you know somebody that can show you one that they're familiar with. I think Postman's pretty widely used. It works pretty well, but there's, as with anything, there's probably a dozen other ones out there. So, I do recommend just getting some understanding of this. One benefit of using Postman is that I can build what are called collections over here. So a collection is basically a set of these different files or commands. Oh, I'm sorry, I did not close out of Teams before I joined here. So basically, it's a collection of different commands that can then be used to create your custom connector in the Power Platform. So I will really jump over to that next. But as I said, if you're not familiar with this, it would be very beneficial to get some training on it. I wasn't overly familiar with collections. I kind of got through them. I probably could have used them better or more to my advantage and had a little bit less manual entry when I created the custom connector. Not that it was bad, but if you were building something with a lot in it, you would want to go this route. It makes it a lot easier because it can take and interpret what's in these files and get you started. So let's go over to Power Platform here again. So I've got I'm in my Power Apps area here, and I'm going to go down to within data, I'm going to go down to my custom connectors. And you'll see here when this populates, I've got a couple sitting here already. Most of these are just copies as I've done different playing and testing with stuff. So I think in my app, I'm actually referencing this customer conference one here. I'm just going to go through this one because I don't want to mess the other one up, but you'll see here quickly what this is all about. So if there was nothing in here, I'm going to start with a new one. So I can create a new one a couple of different ways. I can create one from blank, which I did do on one of these and then brought stuff in. So there's a little bit of data entry, and it's more so just, again, the understanding of how to work with these APIs. The terminology and everything is all the same. So if you've got that mastered pretty well, I think even creating one from scratch is going to be very simple. If you're not as familiar with terminology, you're going to have to go through a little bit. You know, well, where is the header used? When do I use a parameter? Some of those types of things. There's this create from Azure service that's in preview. I have not worked with that. This import from OpenAPI API file I have used, so I can download these. That's this right here. That'll create a file that I can then import. So I have had to move these, and actually how I've created these multiples is some of these I think two of these I created separately, and then one I wanted to test making a copy. And so you can download it and then re-import it, and it'll take you through a little bit of a wizard. I had to move one of these from a separate environment I had within my tenant here. And so I was able to use that to do that. And then finally, as I mentioned, when we were in Postman, I can import from a Postman collection, which I think is probably one of the easier ways to go to get started. But again, you've got to have some of that cursory knowledge of Postman to know how to do it. And there's documentation out there. I think I've got it as a reference at the end of my slide here, or as a suggested resource that will point you to that. But there's a, you know, if you searched, there's a specific things you need to do when you create the collection and how you save it so that it's formatted properly so that it can accept it. So let's just pop into one of these and look at this. So I'm just going to edit this. And it's, again, meant to be fairly, you know, just kind of a very visual based thing. I can pop into a Swagger editor and switch that over. So if you're familiar with that and can work with that, you know, again, that's probably going to be much easier for you. I don't have a lot of familiarity with that, so I just walked through the wizard. It was, you know, other than, again, some of the, you know, as I went through this, as I said earlier, it wasn't necessarily so much about how to use the tool and how to set this up. It was, in a lot of cases, what's the URL format, etc. So, and one of them was right here. So on this general page, there's just some basic information. I can set an icon, background color. I can upload a picture, different things. I just left that alone. We're obviously using HTTPS to authenticate. The host name, you know, this took a little bit of research and guessing to figure out that that's all that it wanted, and then that the base URL was essentially just empty. So that's the first screen that it's taking you through. The next one here is the security screen. So you got to be able to authenticate. So how are you going to have your users authenticate? Are you going to have them enter a username and password for simple authentication, or are you going to use the Azure Active Directory and go that route? So you can see here, I've got this. This is grayed out a little bit, hard to see, but it does say basic authentication. And so don't get confused here. There's lots of warnings here, but even though there's lots of warnings, the first thing I did was come in here and type my username and password. That's not what it's looking for. What it's giving you here is the ability to change the label that's just going to be displayed to the user, or to whoever works with, I should say, whoever's going to work with your connector, your custom connector, so that they know what to enter. So I just left them defaulted username and password. That seems self-explanatory enough, but if you wanted to capitalize those or give them some fancier name, you could certainly do that. But this is, again, this is not where you're entering, as it says here, entering your secrets. You're not entering the username, you're not entering the password. Next step here, again, I can either click up here or back down here. I've got my arrows. So then I just go to the definition. So then here's where I add all of the different API, or all the endpoint calls that I'm going to make. So you'll see here, I've actually got 4 actions here that I've created. I'm only using 2 of them for my application, but I added some of these. One, I was toying with a different way to do this, and then the get companies, I know I would want to use, but I just have not implemented it in the demo application. So general, got a simple summary, a description. None of those are I mean, they're just reference field. Operation ID is what is important. It has to be unique, and this is what's going to get referenced. So when I make a connection to this custom connector and I need to get my companies, that's what I am going to reference, and you'll see that when we get in there. The URL, this is, so then I'm sorry, I get down into the request. So the request is building out that I make. So as I built it out in Postman, this is kind of specifying the same thing. So I have to give it the verb that I'm calling, etc. So the easiest way, if you're not going to import from a Postman collection, is to do this import from sample, and then it basically gives you everything you can do. You got to select your verb that you're going to use. So in my case, it's a get. I give it the URL, which I've already done. This is the same URL I showed earlier. If I had any headers that needed to go with this, and then what's my JSON body that goes with it. So again, if you're not overly familiar so this would work with any API of this type. If you're not familiar with some of this, again, brush up on it because it'll save you a lot of time guessing on how this should go. And then so when I do that, I hit import and then it'll populate everything here. And then finally, there's a response here. This is, I've just left to default. I've not found a reason to change that. There probably are, but I have just left that to default. And then it will, this bomb down here is just doing a validation. It does a quick validation to make sure everything looks right. It's not actually hitting the URL because it doesn't have any user credentials to do so yet, but it is just validating that what I entered looks good. So, so that's the get company. So let's look at the get operations because this is the one I'm actually using. So here's the operation ID that I'll show you in the code that I referenced, get operations. And again, down here, I did the same thing. I did an import from sample and specified everything. The one thing that's different here, and this one I'm going to actually copy this out to Notepad just to show you again. So I've got that basic format, but you'll see instead of having the GUID in the company, I specify a parameter there. So by doing a curly brackets, the name, close curly bracket, now I've created a parameter that can be specified because I don't want to hard code the company name in here. I want to be able to let whoever uses my custom connector to specify the company ID so that it'll work across different companies. Now I am hard coding the environment, which, you know, you could probably quickly argue why you would not want to do that. But you know, I just want to point that out. I have just put the production environment in there. You know, in a production rollout, you probably don't want to have it that way. You want to be able to specify it, probably either control it through your app or with a setting file or something. You're going to want to be able to work against a test environment, a production environment. You're not going to want to go back out and touch this every time, or have multiples. I suppose you could, but if you have multiples, then when you deploy your app, you're going to have to change the reference of the connector. So it would be easier just to take that out of there. So you can see here now, different from the other one I did, it actually populated in a path. And because I put company ID in there, it recognized that. And so now it expects that as a parameter, and I'll show you that in a minute. And then let's look at the most complicated one here. I'm gonna start running out of time. To actually post that output back. So this was the other API that I wrote. And so this is going to be the same where it's going to need a company ID coming in. But the other thing that this takes in is a body, because I have to be able to specify all of those fields that are part of that entity that I'm sending back. So my finished, is it finished? I've got my item number, operation number, order number. So again, I created all of this by going into this import from sample, and then I formatted the body in Postman, and then I just pasted it in here. So in here I would have those field names that it would be expecting, and so that's how it built that out. So that's really the only difference here. Oh, I should call it, well, this is a post command. So instead of getting data here, I'm posting data back to Business Central or to the API and to Business Central. So that's what's built out here. So the final piece of this, once you've got these built out, is you can test it. So I've already created a connection, but I have to create a connection because it has no authentication credentials. So I have to create a connection of this and specify those credentials. And then I can test these. So I'm going to do this test get companies first, so I can test this. And you'll see it gives me the same thing I saw back in Postman. So because I know I need the company ID, I'm just going to copy this, and then I'm going to put this into, I'm going to go to my get operations. So now my get operations, it's looking for a company ID because I had created that parameter. So it can't do anything until I tell it what company ID. So if I paste that in there, I can do test. And just like I saw in Postman, it's going to give me back the operations that are in there. And then that's what I can consume in my app. So So then once I save this and it's out here, then it's a custom connector that's available to be used within my tenant. So I'm going to go back to close out of here. I'm going to go back to my apps. And so I want to design this Power App and show you to wrap up here just how it's connected. And you might be saying, wow, we're just getting to the Power App now. But it's really simple. So there really isn't too much to actually get the data in. So you obviously have to build your app and go through it. But to actually reference and connect the data, there's not a ton of code. And that's really what I wanted to show you here. So first of all, so this is my app in design mode. I showed you this in part 1. But if I go over to the left here, besides my tree view of my application, I can see here the data sources. And so in here, I've got a data source. So this one is against that customer conference one I created, but it could easily be against the one I was just editing. So I've already got this in here. If it weren't here, I just come down to connectors and I would say, oh, I've got a list. So let's say I needed to add this one. I could just simply click on this and add the connector. And then it's going to ask for credentials, which I'll specify. And then I can start interacting with this. So on this screen, so it's already wired up. It's showing me that production order and that output step that I just showed you that it returned. But if I click on this control, I can see how I'm doing that. So I just reference the name of my connection here, which I just showed was down here, dot, and then it's going to show me those operations so I can see the different methods that I've got. So I've got my companies, I've got get operations, output journals, the one I'm not using. And so it's really quite simple. So now I'm going to do my get operation. So again, this was that ID, that command ID that I specified in my custom connector. So I reference that, and then it knows it needs a parameter that is the company ID. And so again, here, hard-coded, so pay no attention to the hard coding. But so I've just put that in there, and then that populates this item or this list. And then I showed you this last time, but again, everything in here is meant to be more formula-driven. So it's this item that I am dot order number. So again, remember the naming that I gave it in my API page, or here the description, item number. So they're just referenced that way. So again, there's not extensive lines of code to wire this up. It's a simple, really just an Excel function. If I go to the second page, screen 2 here, where the data is then entered and then inputted. So on my action button up here is really where all of the code is, which again is not much more than a function. So really the heart of this is just this piece here. These last pieces here, this reset is just to clean up the screen after the fact. But so again, I've got my data connection name dot my value, my methods that are available. So post output, again, that's the same name that I specified in the custom connector. That takes a company ID up there, populates. So you can see it takes a company ID, and then it takes that body that I created. And so the way you specify that is you just put it in curly brackets, no different than you would format any JSON. You give it the element name, colon, and then the value. And so this text input 1, that's just the name of each of these text boxes or values that are on the screen. So this is text box 1, text box 2, etc. So that's all that's doing. So it takes those values off the screen, sends them into the body formatted so that it knows what each one is, and then it posts the output. And then that triggers my logic to then create the item journal line, and magically it ends up in the item journal line in Business Central. So as you can see from the Power App side of it, there's not much to it. You create the connection to your custom connector, and then you can reference it. And when you reference it, it's really just a function call that you're putting in that, again, that looks very much like Excel. So very simple and really quite easy to work with. So I apologize. I've taken us 1 minute over, so I'm going to wrap us up here. That is everything I had to cover. There's really so much you could go through on this topic. I could probably do about 6 sessions on this. But there's really, hopefully today, the goal was just to talk through how do you get the data back and forth. So again, we covered most of this already on how those custom connectors work. So again, thank you for coming today. I do have some suggested resources here. Again, these are the same I showed last time. I think these are probably still the best ones to get you started with, whether it's working with the APIs. This bottom one, this Connect Apps, gives you a good little bit more, gives you an example to work with using Microsoft Graph. And then there was a nice community post working with custom APIs, and then custom connectors with Power Apps. And then I still have that AI builder. I didn't go through that today, but that was certainly much more of a piece of the first part one. So again, we're kind of tight on time. I will open up for questions here. Angie, I don't know if we have any questions.
Thank you, Chad. No, none have come through, but if anybody does have any questions that you want to cover with Chad, please go ahead and get those typed in.
Yeah, and while we'll give you a minute or two here on that, I just thought I'd bring up this slide again, just with my email on it. You can certainly reach out to me with any questions. Again, as I said, there's a lot to kind of share here today. I tried to just take a piece of this and share it with you in an hour, but certainly if you have any questions, my contact information is there. Did
All right.
anything else come in?
Nope, no questions,
okay.
Chad.
All right. Well, I will say thank you to everybody. I appreciate your time today, and running you right up to your time. And I will hand it over to Angie to wrap us up.
All right. Well, thank you again, everyone, for attending, or if you're watching on demand, we thank you for joining us. And to let you know, we have some more webinars coming soon. This afternoon, we actually have Adam Siegel from ChargeLogic. He's going to be presenting on how are you getting customer payments when everyone is remote. And tomorrow, we have Brian McMurray from Experlogic, and he's going to be presenting on improve your quoting speed and accuracy with Experlogic CPQ. And check out our website for more of our upcoming events, and that's enovia.com/events. And I just want to let you know about our podcast that's going on. If you haven't heard of it already, it's called the Enovia Conversation, and you can learn more about our podcast at enovia.com/podcast. So check out the selection that we have and subscribe so you'll be notified when those new episodes air. And Enovia is proud to be a premier sponsor of a couple different conferences that are coming up soon. So I just want to let you know to visit our conference page, and that's enovia.com/conferences. Check out the details for the 2 conferences. It's called Dynamics Con. That's a brand new conference. And then Community Summit. So those are the 2 conferences that you can see all the updated information on our website. All right, well, thank you again, everyone, for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you soon on another Enovia webinar.